We rejoice at all of our children and all of our fathers. Happy Father's Day. We are glad, constantly rejoicing over the wonderful men that we have here that are dads. We're living in a time when our culture, more than ever, doesn't know what it is to be a man, where we are in total confusion and everyone looking everywhere but up for an answer. And we know how important fathers are. Children without fathers are 4 times more likely to live in poverty, more than twice as likely to suffer emotional and behavioral problems, have much higher levels of aggressive behavior, have twice the risk of infant mortality, which is incredible. 1 in 5 prison inmates had their father at home when they grew up. They are twice as likely to be involved in early sexual activity. Dear men, especially fathers, you are a creature of awesome and fearful potential. You have the ability to transform or profoundly degrade the world around you. We know biblically that when men fill the role that men are supposed to fill, that the world around them tends to flourish. And we have quite a many amount of men who are doing that here. And the reason this church is flourishing is largely because of you men. And so we are very thankful for you, for your work as a father, and for your service to this church. And if we are to combat and display Christ in today's culture, then we're going to need you in a desperate way. Which brings us to our topic today, which is not fathers in particular. As you know, what we tend to do here at this church is we spend most of our weeks going through books of the Bible. We just finished a 6-month-long series through the book of 1 Timothy. And then in between those bigger series, we try to look at cultural issues more face on, or issues like we did last week that we want to spend time on, and we spent time around the table. And this week is no different, as we're looking at one of the topics that is prevailing our culture today, which is this one, the topic of transgenderism, the cultural movement that's become quite the modern American religion that we are having to talk about and think about and deal with as Christians. It's a movement that is very difficult to make sense of. But if you're interested in looking at this more, I think the scholar that does the best job of making sense of how we got to where we are now is a man named Carl Trueman in his book called The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. I preached a sermon 7 or 8 months ago on the biblical view of gender. And I know, of course, that all of you memorize all of my sermons and that you remember what I preached on 2 weeks ago, much less 6 months ago. So there's no reason for me to do this, but just for the sake of you, I'm going to remind you what we talked about in that sermon, and just the biblical worldview of gender, how the Bible talks about these ideas that are being tossed around so much today. The big points were these: that in the Bible, gender equals sex. That modernly there's been this distinction made that sex is biological and gender is something else, but that biblically there is no distinction made. That biblically what you are biologically is what you are genderly. The idea of gender is not in the Bible. In fact, it's not in any of humanity until very recently. It was just a linguistic term used for languages as words had genders. But in the 60s, it was applied to humanity, to men and women, and it has gone from there. But biblically, gender equals sex. No such thing as gender apart from sex. Secondly, that the Bible gives us 2 sexes and therefore 2 genders. That humans, as soon as they're created, are identified immediately by their sex. In the garden, when Adam was created, God said, this is the human that is male. And when Eve was created, this was the human that is female. In the perfect paradise Garden of Eden before sin, that is how the world was. Because maleness and femaleness is essential to humanity in a way that nothing else can be. That is, of course, true physically, biologically, but it's also true ontologically, meaning what we are. We are either male or female, and it's been that way since the sinless Garden of Eden. And there's never any indication in the Bible that there is anything else. Thirdly, and perhaps most importantly, we said that God identifies us and our gender, if you will, to use the modern language, by our bodies. You are more than your body, but you are not less than your body. We've spent a lot of time talking about that Platonic problem of separating the body from the soul and seeing the body as a bad physical thing and the soul as the good spiritual thing. But that's not a biblical idea. That's not a biblical way of talking, biblical way of looking at things. Biblically, you are both body and soul. You are not a soul with like a body suit. You are both soul and body throughout the Bible. If your body is injured, you are injured. If your brain is injured, That inhibits your soul if your physical brain is injured. Your growth and maturity from infancy is the direct result of the growth of your body. Your body is you. One of the reasons that we've come to this place in the culture and society currently, where you can be on the inside what you are not on the outside, is part of that problem of separating body and soul with such a sharp and distinguished line in a way that the Bible does not do. You are an embodied creature, and you will be for eternity, by the way. Your body isn't lying to you. One of the last things that doesn't lie to you is your body. You may notice that I'm walking a little gingerly today. That's because I played a slow-pitch softball game 3 days ago, and I'm still feel awful. I feel terrible. I wake up moaning just to try to get out of bed from such a mild activity. But that's because my body is not lying to me. I may feel like I can still do all those things and not wake up sore the next day, but my body tells me the truth. And the same thing is true here. Your body is not lying to you. The message of the Bible is that God identifies us by our bodies, also not by our interests or by the stereotypical ways we think about manhood or womanhood or masculinity or femininity. We see a young boy who likes playing with dolls, and we say, well, he must be a girl. No, he's a nurturing boy. A young girl who likes football and doesn't like dolls. Well, she must be a boy. No, she's a competitive girl. And all humanity has known that forever, that this is not an indication of someone being in the wrong body. It's an indication of God's beautiful variety in creation, that he has made us all differently. And that very often those stereotypes about liking football or these things are just cultural, not biblical, not tied to anything transcendent. It's just kind of our ideas about things. And so God doesn't identify us, our genders, if you will, begin to use that language, by our interests or by our stereotype fitting, but by our bodies. David, one of the most manly men in the Bible, led people to war and played the harp and wrote poetry and those things that we don't identify as stereotypically masculine. But of course, he was no less man because of it. And then finally, God created you in particular, that you exist because the divine, omniscient, omnipotent one without beginning decided for you to exist. That God created you himself. You are an idea from the mind of the divine one, uniquely crafted by the hand of God to glorify him in a special way, unique from anything else he has ever created. That is you, entirely unique. The Creator, thus, can tell you better who you are than even you can. The one who molded you can tell you better who you are than even you can. So your identity cannot be chiefly in your skills or your looks or your financial status or where you were born or your skin color or your interests or who you're attracted to. Your identity is chiefly in the fact that you were made by God and you are a creation that is called to bow to that Creator. If there is a simple thesis that I could give for Christians to the culture currently, it is something like this: to strive to become what God has not made you cannot lead to your flourishing and is an act of rebellion. To strive to become what God has not made you cannot lead to your flourishing and is an act of rebellion. So, our focus today is, how should we as Christians respond? How do I talk to my children? What do I tell my children about how to respond to these people? And this is crucial. If you don't hear this, you may miss the whole thing. There's a distinction that must be made between, we'll just call it transgenderism, the ism, the movement, the ideology, and people that are involved in the movement. When it comes to how we as Christians should respond to the ideology, the movement, the action against Christianity and Christians' foundational beliefs, we should feel a righteous anger. We should feel a willingness to be bold about these things. But how should we respond to the people that are in this movement? I've got a few things, and we'll be done. First, and there's a reason it comes first, you are to love them radically. Love them radically. Not every transgender is an activist trying to change you, like the ideology is. Most of them are just hurting and confused. So how are we as Christians supposed to respond to the hurting and the confused? We, myself included, tend to get really defensive and aggressive with this topic, largely largely because of the media, like everything else, which tends to pick the polarized parts of the discussion, those that are on the extreme on one side and the extreme on the other, because that's what gets the most clicks, that's what gets the most views. And so we go in thinking that the only thing that exists is the extreme and those that hate us and are actively trying to change us, when in reality, most of them are just hurting and confused and have simply grabbed onto a new branch of the old as Eden tree of idolatry. And a branch, by the way, that is not far away from the branch that you used to hold on to before you were Christ's. The ideology of transgenderism is everywhere, and it's across all ages, but it is clear. If anything is clear about the movement, the clearest thing is that it is most prevalent in the young people in our country. That the chart goes like this as you move into younger ages. That there are less and less as you get older and more as you get younger. It is prevailing with young people today, today's teenagers and today's 20s. And so we think, well, this is entirely new and entirely unique. And of course, there's part of it that is. But these are teenagers who are hurting. These are teenagers who are looking for identity. These are 20-somethings who are looking for where they belong, trying to figure out who they are and their place in the world. That's about as old a thing as there is. Sure, this avenue of searching is new, but young people that are confused and hurting is far from novel. Young people putting their identity in the wrong place is constant. This one puts his identity in this gender decision. This one puts it in sports. This one in girls. This one in academic success. This one in popularity. They're all missing it. They're all harming themselves. They're all worshiping idols. Asking today how Christians should respond to the whole LGBTQ ideology and transgenderism is often not different than asking how Christians should respond to people that are hurting and that are confused. If I came up to you after church and said, there's a transgender teen here, would you mind talking with them? What would you do? If I came up to you after church and said, there's a teenager here that's hurting and confused, looking for a place to belong, trying to find themselves, and desperately wanting to be loved, would you mind talking with them? Would that change things? We are, as Christians, given a very clear instruction about how to handle outsiders. In Mark chapter 2, Jesus says, when Jesus heard it, the it is, they said, this man fellowships with sinners. When Jesus heard it, he said to them, those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick, I came not to call the righteous, but the sinners to repentance. This man eats with sinners. He fellowships with the sinners, with the outsiders, with the outcast. 1 John chapter 4, beloved, if God so loved us, we also ought to love one another. I love this line. No one has ever seen God. Listen to the logic here. Listen to the reasoning. No one's ever seen God. If we love one another, God abides in us and his love is perfected in us. God is invisible. No one has seen him. But if you love, they see God in you. That God abides in you when you love those that God has created. That God becomes visible, the invisible made visible through your actions. We as Christians know what is true. We know what is best for these people in this movement, but they aren't going to care if they don't feel like you love them truly. So the first call is honestly, truly care about them as you would any person that's struggling. Be kind. Make sure that you know, that they know that you are for them. We say all the time that evangelism is not much more than one blind beggar who has found the riches of God's treasures, the riches of his food, who is trying to help another blind beggar find food. That doesn't change when the struggle is related to gender. Love them, knowing that you were once like them. Hungry, confused, idolatrous. Don't see them as entirely other. See them as you without Jesus. These are confusing times, right? We're on the frontier of all this stuff, and it's hard to know what exactly we should be doing and how we should be speaking and all these things. I've read books and books on the topic, and there's still things that I'm not totally sure about. So when in doubt, love. When in doubt, care for them, love them, and act in a way that you think is responding in love. Treat them like Christ treated the outcast, knowing that they are hurting. 1 Peter 4:8, above all, keep loving each other earnestly, since love covers a multitude of sins. That's a fascinating line. Romans 13, owe no one anything except to love each other, for the one who loves has fulfilled the law. Colossians 3, above all these, put on love, which binds everything together in perfect unity. 1 John 4, so we have come to know God and to believe the love that God has for us. God is love, and whoever abides in love abides in God. Love them radically. 1 Corinthians 13, if I speak in the tongues of men and of angels but have not love, I am only a resounding gong or a clanging cymbal. And if I have the gift of prophecy, can fathom all mystery and all knowledge but have not love, I have nothing. And if I give all I possess to the poor and surrender my body to the flame but have not love, I am nothing. This is incredibly true now. If you have all the right answers and all the truth and you do not love them, you are a resounding gong or a clanging cymbal. You are simply making noise because they will not listen to what you have to say. Love them radically. But love them radically without approving. Love them radically without approving. Now this is important because our modern world says that's not possible. Right? The modern call of this movement is you either affirm me or you hate me. Dear Christian, the Bible will not allow you to do either one of those things. God will not allow you to hate them or to affirm them. One of the most important things you can sink into your heart, into the heart of your children, is that it's not true that you either affirm or you hate. That the biblical call is the call much higher than that, to love them, but to love them well means to not approve of the thing that is harming them. To say it a different way, the second point is to be unashamed for the sake of their soul. Be unashamed of Jesus, be unashamed of Christ, be unashamed of the gospel for the sake of their soul. Romans 1:16, of course, I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it's the power of God to salvation. This verse, more than any other verse, was if there was a drumbeat of my college life and all of my friends in college, it was Romans 1:16. We were all fired up about Romans 1:16. We couldn't get to the tattoo parlor fast enough to get Romans 1:16. It was everywhere. Not as cool, of course, as Peyton's tattoo that he has on his back. If you haven't seen that one, go get him after church and make sure it's wonderful, mostly because of its profundity. But everyone was going because this verse really had an impact on us. It really impacted me and the young people, because this call to unashamed living in this culture is an important one. That we are called to be unashamed of what we believe and of Christ. And this is crucial. It's not be unashamed so that they'll know that you're right. It's not be unashamed so that you'll win all the arguments. It's be unashamed because you have the gospel that is the power to save them. It's be unashamed because you are walking around with the fountain of living water in a desperately thirsty world. And so how can we be ashamed of the fountain that will give them life, that will allow them to finally drink of the thing that they've been looking for in all the wrong places? Be unashamed of the gospel. Be unashamed of Jesus. You have the answer, dear Christian, for who they are, for their identity, for where they belong, for all the questions they are asking, all the hopes they have for finding answers in this gender-obsessed culture. You have better answers. You know what is true. Therefore, don't be ashamed. The end of Romans chapter 1 and verse 32, Paul says, though they know God's righteous decree that those who practice evil deserve to die, they not only do them, but give approval to those who practice them. Dear Christian, you cannot approve. You cannot affirm. And you can't precisely because you love them. You cannot approve of the things that harm them. If my sons or my daughter, if one day they got caught up in drugs and they were doing drugs and they came to me and said, Dad, you either affirm me doing drugs or you hate me, I would say, son, it is precisely because I love you that I cannot approve of this. That is the same thing, that we as Christians know that there is nothing but harm in that worldview, that novel and new worldview, those new places being looked for identity and answers. There's nothing but harm there until we cry out desperately because we love them. The answers are in Christ and found nowhere else. Sink it deeply into your heart that the options are not affirm or hate. The call of the Christian is better than both of those. It's to love. 1 Peter 3, verse 15. Peter says, always be prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for the reason of the hope that's in you. Yet, here's that call again, do it with gentleness and with respect. Colossians 4, Walk in wisdom toward outsiders. Let your speech be gracious, seasoned with salt, so you may know how you ought to answer each person. Tell them what is true, but do it honestly from love and from care. Make sure they know that it's coming from love. Be gentle, be gracious, show them respect, but don't lie to them. Finally, thirdly, expect to be slandered. Expect to be slandered. Don't be surprised, dear brothers. Same verse we just looked at, 1 Peter 3, says, do it with gentleness and respect, having a good consciousness, so that when, big word, when you are slandered, those who revile your good behavior in Christ may be put to shame. This is, again, directly in context of saying when you speak the truth to people who don't want to hear the truth, the result is going to be that you will be slandered. So don't be surprised. The result is going to be that ill will be spoken of you. Matthew chapter 5. Jesus says, blessed are you when others revile you and persecute you, and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad. There hasn't been much of that in America historically. But there has been recently, and it's only going to increase. Of Christians being reviled, of Christians being mocked, of Christians being insulted, and uttered all kind of evil against us that's not true. Don't be surprised. 2 Timothy 3, verse 12, of course. All who desire to live a godly life in Christ will be persecuted. 1 Peter 4, beloved, do not be surprised at the fiery trial when it comes upon you to test you as though something strange were happening to you. If you're insulted by the name of Christ, because of the name of Christ, you are blessed. I told this story years ago, but when Jerry was 5 or 6, I love how I can feel my son get nervous. Right? When Jerry was 5 or 6, I was outside. Jerry used to love coming outside and just doing stuff with me, even if it wasn't all that fun. But I was outside pulling weeds in the garden bed around the house. And that's a joyous occasion, pulling weeds. Not many things worse than pulling weeds. It's definitely part of the fall. There weren't weeds in the Garden of Eden. We have them now. And as soon as you get done with the other side of the bed, you've sprouted some new ones in the beginning. It's an awful exercise. So I'm in the dirt, and I'm pulling these weeds. My hands are hurting. I'm sweating. It's Alabama summer. Not having a wonderful time. Jerry pops his little head out. Says, hey, Dad, what you doing? I said, I'm pulling weeds. And he said, can I join? And I said, yeah. Go get your dirty clothes on. Clothes you can get dirty and come on. So he goes and changes and comes back out all excited. And he's down there with me, and I show him how to do it. And that lasts about 5 minutes. And Jerry says, hey, Dad, this isn't fun. And I remember thinking, hey, Jerry, you looked out here and saw me, right? You saw what was going on. You saw that it wasn't roller coasters and butterflies. You saw I was dirty and I was sweating and I wasn't smiling in particular. And you're the one that said you wanted to help. How did you think this was going to go down, right? Did you think it was going to be transformed entirely when you became part of the process? It's still dirty. It's still hard. It's still hot out here. It seems very often that we think that when we decided to follow Jesus, we were following a man who was made famous by the world and was praised by the world, who was given everything by the world, who was thought very highly of by the world, and we've forgotten that. He lived his life homeless and ashamed and mocked, and at its peak, a couple of hundred followers at the most, and most of them left when he was killed and was spit upon and was killed. That's how the world thought of Jesus. You said you wanted to follow him. How did you think this was going to go down? That the world was going to love you because of your opinions, because of your positions, because of the Bible? Very often we forget the one that we are following and the way he was treated by the world, and the way that we'll be treated because of that as well. John 15. It's like he could say this to us today. Jesus says, if you were of the world would love you. But because you are not of the world, but I chose you out of the world hates you. If they persecuted me, they will persecute you. The cost to be a Christian is returning. And that's not a bad thing. You remember these 3 men, of course. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These young men. We don't know how old they were. Could have been teens, could have been 20s. They were young. As the rest of the nation, both of Babylon and Jerusalem and the other nations Babylon had conquered, bowed down to this statue, this new thing, these 3 young men refused to bow, knowing what it would likely mean for them was their death, their painful, torturous death in this fiery furnace. And they refused to bow. What do you think? What do you think the Babylonians thought when these three brazen children, these young men, wouldn't bow? What about the Jews who were there bowing, looking at them, thinking, dude, just do it. We don't mean it, we know, but just bow. Just bow, and we'll get past it. And they just refused. Transgenderism and this whole ideology that's currently the place is the closest cultural parallel to this moment that I can remember, where the culture is demanding that you bow, demanding that you not just tolerate in the oldest sense of the word, but approve. As Christians, we just can't bow. When the boys were brought to Nebuchadnezzar, they were respectful toward him. They treated him like a king. They gave him proper honor. They simply decided that they would rather die than bow. C.S. Lewis, last thing, famous quote, he said, when the whole world is running toward a cliff, he who is running in the opposite direction appears to have lost his mind. The great goal of your life, dear Christian, is not popularity. If it is, you chose the wrong Messiah. The great goal of your life is to avoid insults and pain. If it is, you chose the wrong Messiah. The great goal of your life is to exalt Jesus, to shine his light, to love others enough to offend them if it means telling them the truth. Don't be surprised when the darkness hates you for it. Love them radically. When in doubt about how to handle a situation, love them radically. But love them in a way that doesn't approve of the thing that is harming them. Don't be ashamed for the sake of their soul and expect, dear brothers and sisters, dear Christians, to be slandered because of that. It's going to happen. But if we're going to love them well, if we're going to be Jesus and be the one that makes God visible appropriately, then that's what we're called to. If we can help you at all, the reason the church exists is not because God needs us to gather each week and worship him. It's because he knows we need each other. If you're not a Christian and you want to know this God, you can stay after and ask questions. You will not offend us no matter what you ask. But you can come now while we stand and while we sing.